What's up, everybody? My name's Adam McDormand, and this is Medium Quality. Even as a person who is fairly early on in his journey with jazz, I still have a great fondness for albums like Kind of Blue and In a Silent Way and even The Brew. But there's also this era of Miles Davis that is deeply contested that I have a great fondness for. And so I want to do a quick check-in and look at an era of Miles Davis's career that actually constitutes the bulk of my jazz collection in general, and certainly the majority of the Miles Davis records that I own, and that is late Miles. Now, the first thing I want to do is preface this entire video by saying that I am by no means an expert on Miles Davis or jazz music. This is a snapshot of a moment in time of my interest in jazz music. And as I was doing just the tiniest amount of research to give myself some context for Miles Davis's late work, I did discover a book that looks really interesting called The Last Miles by George Cole. That's something that I'm interested in reading, and maybe in a couple of years after I've rounded out my collection of Miles Davis records a little bit more, and maybe possibly even read the book, I can come back and we can take a look at this period again. But for the time being, I really like late Miles. So as I understand it, and feel free to drop in the comments and add to this as you see fit, Miles Davis retired in the mid-70s, and then he came back in 1981 with an album called Directions, and continued to produce music until the end of his life. Even to the casual listener, there is a very big difference between 1981 Miles and mid-70s Miles. And understandably, for me as a child of the 80s, I have a nostalgia for these sounds, even though many of these records are ones that I've just discovered in recent years. So I don't care what anybody says, 80s Miles is awesome. And I've gone out of my way to pick up several of these records over the past couple of years, and I'm going to show them to you. First up, You're Under Arrest from 1985. Now, in the rough narrative that I've cobbled together in my head about late Miles, I see You're Under Arrest as a real turning point in his career. He's experimenting with sounds that are a little bit more pop sensible, and I think that's why the hardcore Miles Davis fans tend to write off this album and the ones that come after it. Let's be fair, he covers Michael Jackson and Cyndi Lauper on this album. I think that's cool. And Human Nature is probably my favorite Michael Jackson song, and he does a really cool rendition of that song on this album. Turns out that this is the last album that Miles Davis puts out on Columbia Records. After that, he makes a switch. Now again, I'm no expert, but one could assume that he was looking for something different. He wanted to move into a different creative space and have access to different players to create music with. And it would appear that that's exactly what he does, because in 1986, he puts out his first album with Warner Brothers Records, Tutu. Now this is the start of a run of records that he makes with the legendary bass player, producer, songwriter, multi-instrumentalist Marcus Miller. In some ways, it's kind of a more refined version of You're Under Arrest. It seems like the collaboration with Marcus Miller added some clarity and focus to this album that just makes it great to listen to. Of course, bringing a funk bassist into your band to make jazz music with adds a little bit of a different flavor to it, and so it doesn't sound like Miles from the bebop era or Miles from the jazz fusion era. This has a funkier, more pop sensible feel to it. And this recent vinyl reissue of Tutu includes a live performance from 1986 that by itself is worth the price of admission. It takes a couple of songs from You're Under Arrest and a couple of songs from this album and kind of unifies them, puts them together, and I would be willing to bet that the live record hits my turntable maybe even a little more than the studio part of this album. It's that good. People don't like Tutu, I like Tutu, I'm giving you permission to like Tutu. The next year, in 1987, we get Music from Siesta. Now, this is a soundtrack to a film, and it appears to be attempting to recapture the magic of Sketches of Spain, which is one of Miles Davis's earlier works. But most of the songs here are being written by Marcus Miller. But in some ways, it's still kind of a throwback. It is more in line with what the traditional Miles Davis fan might have been looking for, but not necessarily written by Miles Davis. Now, what's here is still great. As a part of this Miles Davis-Marcus Miller collaboration, there's still some magic that's here, even though it is sort of reaching back into the tradition and history of Miles Davis's work. It's a really nice addition to this era of his career. Then in 1989, we get the final collaboration between Miles Davis and Marcus Miller, Amandla. Now, for me, this is the most refined version of the type of music that Miles and Marcus were making. If you like Tutu, this is that, but polished to a mirror sheen. It is a pristine album. I can kind of understand why the classic Miles Davis fan hears this and wishes for something else. Wishes for the more organic, the more earthy, the more human sounding Miles Davis work. Because, let's face it, this is the late 80s. The musical landscape has changed drastically from the 70s. Things are more electronic. There are more synthesizers here. There is a different type of production and mixing, and you're just never gonna get a Miles Davis album that sounds like In a Silent Way or Kinda Blue. It's just not gonna happen. And Miles Davis was never the sort of artist who wanted to recreate his work of the past. And so, yes, according to some, his attempt to forge ahead may not have been successful. Maybe he didn't capture lightning in a bottle again, but for me, these albums are great, and Amandla in particular was a gateway into this period of Miles Davis for me. And later in 1989, we get what would end up being the final Miles Davis album from his lifetime, and that is Aura. And this is a very different sounding album than the run of albums that came before it. No longer is Marcus Miller involved. Gone are any traces of funk or really pop sensibility, and we get Miles kind of giving us one final classic jazz album. And yes, it is still produced like the albums of that era. It still has that shiny, pristine style of production that very much typifies the late Miles albums. But this album is more conceptual. It's compositions that match certain colors, and the emotional feel of Miles's playing is put front and center. There's nothing to get between you and Miles here. No funk bass lines. It's just Miles crafting a mood, crafting several moods. And I think it's very, very successful at accomplishing that. And in a way, then it serves as a bookend to this period of Miles Davis's career and really the end of Miles Davis's work as an artist. I truly think he went out on a high note here. But to the outside observer, it seems like Miles Davis practically lived in the studio. There are so many Miles Davis releases that came out after his death, including a somewhat recent one called Rubber Band. Rubber Band is a really interesting album to me because it was recorded in the mid-80s. So it is from that same period as You're Under Arrest and Tutu and Amandla, but it was released in 2019 and released with a great amount of care and attention to detail. This album isn't simply a release of some studio tapes with very little work done to it. The producers that Miles Davis was working with during that period came back to these recordings in the recent years and kind of built a new album around Miles Davis's work. So let's be clear, this is not just old sessions warmed over, maybe remastered and shoved out onto vinyl. These are fresh recordings around Miles Davis's playing. And because a lot of the performances here are being mixed and mastered for the first time, this has a very modern sound to it. Reading the liner notes of this album, it really seems like the producers wanted to capture the spirit of Miles Davis, always moving forward, always moving ahead, always trying to innovate. And so this album feels very modern, even though the playing is 30 plus years old. Because of the fact that there's some R&B and almost hip-hop elements to this, this has a little bit of a lo-fi kind of chill beats vibe to it. And I say that not to denigrate the work on this album, because this is not just a cheap remix of a song that's thrown onto YouTube. This is a very lovingly created set of songs that are still modern sounding. I can definitely see how this album would be up for debate because Miles simply isn't around to see this to completion. But I really do think that it's a really interesting album and very respectfully done. And in a lot of ways, because this is more of a modern sounding album, I would make the case that this could be a good gateway to getting into Miles Davis, giving us another avenue with which we can approach the master himself. Really cool album. Very glad that it exists, and super glad to have it in my collection. And so I've shown you every single Miles Davis record that I own, and that's going to do it for this video. If you liked it, please give it a thumbs up. If you want to see more, make sure you hit the subscribe button. And if you're really enjoying the videos that I'm making, I'm going to put a link in the description section below where you can get some pretty cool medium quality merch. Until next time, guys, keep spinning that good stuff. What a time to be alive.